Welcome into a brand new episode of the Whole Story Podcast. On today's episode, Jason Fitz, who is host of First Take, Your Take, and host of many other social media digital shows with ESPN. Jason, thanks so much for taking the time. I got my cup of coffee here this morning, and it's great to talk with you this morning.
Well, man, thanks for having me. And yeah, I've got mine as always on brand. It's in a Raiders cup, but I've got my iced coffee. Okay, I'm just going to take you off the rails before we've even started.
Sure.
But one of the things that was weird for me when we got to quarantine is I didn't realize how much Starbucks I consume, like so many people. And for anyone that's ever seen the commercial, the Sports Center commercial, the WWE one, they were at a little Starbucks that's on campus, and I didn't realize that we were no longer on campus and I was no longer able to go, how much coffee I consumed every day. So it took me about 3 days before I finally took the plunge and got one of those Ninja like iced coffee makers.
Yeah.
So it's alarming that, I spent a long time waiting for the Ninja, and now I am just, I'm that thing gets used every day, all day for me. So I'm curious when things get back to normal, like, because my budget really likes me not going to Starbucks so much. So we'll see what happens. I don't know.
Yeah, I agree with you. I usually go to either Starbucks or Dunkin' Donuts every morning when I was back at school. But now that I'm home, I have a Keurig and I just use that. But I'm from upstate New York. Now, I drink iced coffee pretty much all year round. I know down there in Connecticut, it gets cold in the wintertime, obviously. Do you still drink iced coffee all year round?
Oh yeah, yeah. It's a year-round thing, and I work a lot with Mike Golick Jr. and we're the two idiots that I think everybody laughs at constantly because I go iced coffee all year, every year. And I used to do. I haven't been able to as much lately, but I did a lot of Sports Center on Snapchat hosting when I first started, and so I was at the time on radio with Sarah Spain. So we would do the night shift and then 6 to 9 p.m. And then I'd go over to the next building and we would get ready for Snapchat. We'd be on campus till about 2, 3 in the morning. And inevitably, in the middle of winter, I would walk across campus in the snow, get my iced coffee, and come back. And they all look at me like everybody in the conference room for Sports Center would look at me like I was the biggest moron because I'd have 2 big iced coffees. And I'm like, what? I don't like hot drinks. Hot drinks don't do it for me.
And it's easier to drink. You get, with a hot coffee, you have to wait for it to cool down. And then by that time, you already have that headache. So
right?
I go iced coffee right away. Right away, iced coffee.
You and me both. You and me both.
But Jason, it's always great, and especially just to talk with people that I truly look up to in the industry. And, what's really been one of the biggest fun things for me to see you do, and we talked about this before we got started, but being someone that you can do pretty much a little of everything. And I think that's crucial, where, especially right now in the sports industry, you have to do a little of everything. It's not just you show up at the radio station, you do a radio show, then you go home. Like, there's so much more that goes into it. When you started with ESPN back in 2016, what was one thing once you started there that you realized, oh, I didn't know this went along with this job?
Wow, that's a great question. I don't know that there was one thing that stood out that I didn't know went along with the job. I think what really surprised me at ESPN, to be cheesy for a second, is how open and great everybody on campus was. I came from a music world where it's very cutthroat and very competitive. At least in my experience, one of the craziest things to me is that, I just started with the company, and I remember the day I emailed Kevin Negandhi. I was just starting to get on campus, and I love his work. And so I emailed him and said, hey, you don't know me, I don't know you, but I'd love to sit down in the caf that I just mentioned, grab coffee and pick your brain. And a couple of days later, I was in the caf for hours with Kevin Negandhi, who was saying, giving me the help on how to navigate. And I think the one thing that I think is surprised me was, in all transparency, when I first made the plunge, I didn't imagine that I was going to be in Connecticut anytime soon. My wife and dogs are in Nashville. And so when I got offered Spain and Fitz, part of the deal that they required was that I moved to Connecticut, which was a little bit earth shaking for us. And, that was just a surprise. We didn't expect it. And I'll never forget talking to some of the bosses, and they said, part of the reason you need to be here is because opportunity comes when you are here. And I don't think I really understood that. Like, to this day, when campus is open, even if I bring my lunch, I sit in the cafeteria and I eat lunch, because as people walk by, they're like, they see, and there's sort of a music adage, out of sight, out of mind, right? It's the same thing. The number of times I've made great connections with people just because they walk by and said, "Oh, I realized I haven't seen you." Like, it is amazing how that has worked for my career. So I think that's one thing that surprised me. I didn't realize, I thought I was being hired to do radio and that breaking in everywhere else would be virtually impossible. And instead, what I found is that if you're there and you're willing to do things, people are willing to use you. So it's been really, that's been eye-opening for me.
Mm-hmm. What's been one of your most favorite projects or shows that you get to work on? Is it a little bit of everything that you like to do, or do you have the one thing that when you were first approached to do it, you're like, yes, I want to do this?
Well, I think for me, all of it has been amazing because my brain doesn't like sitting still. I'll be the first to admit that. So I like the challenge of having to do different things on different platforms because they handle each sport so differently. But if there's a favorite project for me, the first ever show that we did on Twitter, Rankings Reaction, which is something Mike Golick Jr. and I have done on live stream after the playoff rankings come out. It started, that one started, I guess, back in 2016 as well, if memory serves me correct, the jumble of 16 or 17. But when I got the call to do that, at the time, they'd never done it. There'd never been a live stream. So there is a hall of history at ESPN that connotates different moments in ESPN history. And one of the pictures in that hallway is me sitting on Mike Golick Jr.'s couch wearing an inflatable horse because it was a Halloween episode and that was my costume, talking about college football. And the funny thing is, when we did that show the first time, there were two people with they had iPhones and they were just filming with iPhones and putting it up. And to this day, we do the show every year at Junior's house, but now there's a massive crew and there's still some cell phone element to it, but there's TV crews and there's TV studios involved, and it's become this massive thing and this undertaking to still do it in his living room. But that show will always hold a soft spot for me because it was the first ever digital show. And to this day, that's a huge part of what I do. I mean, it opened up the landscape. And I said at the time, my dream would be to be sort of what Reese Davis is to game day. I'd love to be to college football fans on the digital side. And that opportunity has really opened up for me, all from Rankings Reaction, as crazy as that is. So that show holds a soft spot in my heart.
What's interesting about digital shows, it has grown tremendously from when you first did your first back in 2016, 2017 to now, where right now in the history of the country and the world, really social media is the only thing people have to be connected with one another. What's been one of your biggest eye-openers to the growth and innovation that social media has kind of gone on, not maybe in the last 3 years, but the last 3 months?
I think the biggest thing about the social media shows in general is that they are far harder than anyone thinks. And one of the things that I constantly look back on, the first time we covered the national championship game, it was Georgia-Bama. And I remember two things about that broadcast we did beforehand. One was that they brought all this food out and we ate stadium food and had a good time and everybody laughed about it. But the other was we had a deep dive conversation about the fact that because at the time Jalen Hurts had missed some practices because he was sick, Tua Tagovailoa, who at the time nobody had heard of, had gotten a little bit more time in reps going up to the championship game. And I remember Mike saying at the time, hey, watch out. If Jalen struggles in the first half of this game, there could be a quarterback switch. And I always use that example because I think what is lost even now in digital shows is that you can be funny and you can be smart. The hard part is doing both and keeping the audience, because if all you ever is funny and shtick, then eventually the audience falls off. And when you talk about passion, like you talk about college football, talk about baseball, the NFL, like anybody that's going to watch these games on digital is a diehard. And they know right away if you haven't done your homework, if you don't know what you're talking about, if you don't know the team. So I often say, like, you don't have the safety net. You don't get commercials on these shows. So if something's going wrong, if your earpiece isn't working, you can't hear the truck. We've had multiple shows in my lifetime where I've just had to take them out, watch a clock, and hope that we're communicating because there's issues and you don't get the 4-minute reset during a break to figure out what's wrong, right? So to me, I think the eye-opening part is it takes a lot more work and you have to really understand that you need the fun stuff comes easy. You got to make sure that you get the smart stuff in if you want these shows to succeed. And I think that's even now, look at Jalen and Jacoby, who've succeeded tremendously with their Last Dance recaps, partially because Jalen and Jacoby have great chemistry and they're fun to watch, but also because they lived this era so much. They know this era so much. They can offer something extra. And that's the biggest thing with digital. You can be relaxed, but you still got to offer something extra.
When you first started at ESPN, did it go through your mind, I have to work this extra hard to earn the credibility of not the people behind the scenes, but the fans that are tuning in watching you?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like they always talk about how athletes have a chip on their shoulder. We know that, right? I don't think it's that much different for people that come from a music background. Like anytime you make it to whatever the 1% is, and you know, I say that with incredible humility. Like I'm honored that I got to the level. There aren't that many guys that can say that they toured at the highest level that were violinists, right? So it took a lot to get there, and so that competitive edge is part of how I'm wired. But you bet your butt, the minute that I started in this, the number of why do we care about this musicians take that I still get it. You didn't play the game. And I always laugh about that because the tweets that come in that it's like, well, you didn't play, so you don't know. Cool. If that's the argument we're going to take, then if you didn't tour at the highest level, I never want to hear your review of a concert. If you weren't an actor that won an Academy Award, I don't want to hear your movie reviews. Like, so I've always taken that I feel like the world is ready for me to make a mistake and pounce on it. So it keeps me motivated to absolutely make sure that I'm better prepared. And they still laugh at me. I'm the guy that shows up, whatever the time is for a show. I'm the guy that's there an hour before because it's natured in me that I don't have benefit of the doubt, and I'll keep working forever because I presume that I'll never get it because of my background. But now my background has become part of what people embrace. And I remember the first time that Junior and I hosted Mike and Mike, and it was still Mike and Mike at the time. It was the July 3rd edition before they'd switched over to Go Look at Wingo. And it was my first time in the big chair hosting Mike and Mike. I was scared out of my mind. And, you know, I showed up and I was doing my best, and I thought we were doing a really good show. And I got on Twitter afterwards, and there were hundreds of, "You're the reason ESPN sucks. You're awful. I hope you die. I hope your family dies." The typical tweets. And it shook me so much, I had to actually get off Twitter for a little while. Like, I just couldn't handle, I was working my tail off, and I'm still a human being. So hearing your work sucks is really tough, you know? But the funny part of that story is a year later, to the day, it was Go Look and Wingo, Junior and I hosting the same July 3rd edition. And the tweets were hundreds of, "You guys are the future. Why don't you have your own show? I love this. They need to make this combo bigger." And it just shows you that no matter what you're doing, people hate change, and you have to work hard to win them over. But once you do win them over, I think eventually that fandom, it's much like country music, like that fandom sticks, and fans will stick with you in sports. You just got to win them first.
Now, you mentioned, again, through this, but for anyone that doesn't know, you played a part of the band Perry. You were a fiddle player and also a musical director. What was one thing that you took away after your time in the music industry that you took to the sports industry?
Everything. Like, I know that's a cheesy answer, but I've said a lot, like everything I ever learned as a musician prepared me for what I do today. And in the sense that, I mean, there's 1,000 examples, but for me, I was a classically trained violinist. I got to Juilliard when I was 10. I played Carnegie Hall when I was 10. I transitioned to fiddle when I was later in life because, frankly, it's easier. You can practice less, and the girls like it more. So, like, it was all very easy to transition to singing and then becoming a fiddle player, right? So all of that was sort of my natural progression. But the work ethic, the competition, the competitiveness, those are all part of what is wired into what makes me good at what I do today. But then another huge part of it is, let's be real, like, you in country music, you'll play 250 shows in a year, which means If I Die Young was our biggest hit, I might have played that 300 or 400 times in a year. There are times that you don't give a damn about playing that song. Like, let's be real. You walk out on stage, you're hungry, you're tired, you miss your family, you don't really feel like playing this yet again. It's your 300th show of the year. It's somebody else's first. And every time I walked out on stage and I didn't feel like doing it, I remembered my first concert. And I always remember that moment of being in the crowd and watching, it was Bon Jovi, watching Richie Sambora explode and land on stage and thinking, this is the coolest moment of my life. And that was what I always thought. Like, there's some little kid in the crowd that's never been to a concert today, so I have to bring it for him. I think that ability to look at it and say, even when you're not there, you're still putting on a show. You still got to bring a certain level of energy. You still have to bring excitement. And even if it's a song you don't care about, or even, frankly, a song you don't like, you have to play the heck out of it because that's what the audience deserves. They came to you. They gave you money. That's what the audience deserves. That's no different. Like, I don't like the LeBron James versus Michael Jordan debate. I think it's useless, and it's the grown-up version of my dad can beat up your dad. You can't prove anybody right or wrong. But if that's what the audience wants to have, then I have a responsibility to come in and bring fire and passion to that argument. There are days on First Take Your Take where my job is to get the crowd fired up about what they argued about on First Take. There are days I don't like their topics or their arguments, but it's not my job to come in and hijack the show. My job is to get people involved in a First Take argument. So I look at that every day and say, these are the things that really prepared me to do what I do. Everything I learned about hustle and grind and work ethic and then learned about consistency and performance in music makes me who I am today in sports.
I always wonder, and I ask my parents this question, do artists ever get sick of playing songs? And then they say, I'm sure it's a component to where it's almost like a kid. Each song is like a kid. But I have to ask you, do you ever get sick of hearing a song or playing one song?
1,000, yes, all day. And any artist that tells you otherwise is lying. And my favorite story on this is one of the first guys I played for in Nashville, a singer-songwriter that had a lot of success named Phil Vassar. And if you're an early 2000s country fan, a lot of his songs. They were recorded by Tim McGraw and Martina McBride. He had a ton of number ones, but he also had a good run of his own as an artist. So I played for Phil for a little bit when I was first getting road work, and a great human being. But we did a show with the Boston Pops. And so I wrote the orchestral arrangements to these songs that were performed by the Boston Pops. And so I'm hanging out with John Williams before the encore of the show. We played one of Phil's big hits was a song called Just Another Day in Paradise. And Phil joked before he went out on stage. And I mean, it's just a joke, but he's not. He's like, God, I'm so tired of the song. It just happens sometimes, right? But he said that joke. And I'll never forget, right before the encore, they were about to go out and do Star Wars. So John Williams going to go out, conduct the Boston Pops on Star Wars. And he looks at Phil and he says, man, as tired as you are of your hits, I'm that tired of this one. And then he walked out and did the entire score of Star Wars from memory. He didn't even look at the music. He was just conducting Star Wars. So if John Williams can be tired of Star Wars, we can all be tired of anything.
Do you still listen to country music all the time? And if so, what's kind of one of your new favorite songs that you love to listen to?
That's a great question. I was never a massive country listener in the first place. So, the funny thing is, I grew up a classical music kid. My dad was super into oldies. My mom was into the Eagles and 70s rock. I didn't really grow up around country music other than Kenny Rogers. That was the one exception. But he had come from sort of a rock background. So people forget in the 80s, Kenny Rogers was kind of a crossover artist. So for me, it was Garth Brooks in the late 90s that really turned me on to country. Like I fell in love with Garth in that era of Tim McGraw and Colin Ray and like that sort of those and Diamond Rio, all of those things there. So while I respected the heck out of country and I really loved modern country, I'm not the guy that goes back and listens to a lot of old Waylon and Willie. Now I found that stuff later, but it wasn't a huge influence to me. So the funny thing is when I was on the road, I stopped listening to country because the last thing I wanted to hear was more of what I was hearing every single day. Now that I don't tour, I listen to more country now than I did then because I happen to like a lot of it. And it takes me down memory lane. I mean, I spent years of my life between all the acts I played for, touring with Blake and Brad Paisley and Keith Urban and, all of these different Darius Rucker, all these different people. So it takes me back when I listen to it. So it's a little walk down memory lane. I am literally the guy that when I say I listen to everything, I listen to everything. Like I have a massive love affair with Frank Sinatra. I also have a massive love affair with Tupac. I also have in high school in the 90s, I was in Bowie, Maryland at that time. And that's PG County, Maryland. Like I went to a high school where when Eazy-E died, they actually put banners off of my high school ceiling celebrating NWA. So I a little bit of everything, like Boyz II Men is a huge influence to me. So I listen to a lot of, I'd say a lot of everything. There is a lot of country out right now that I think is good. Like I think Jordan Davis is a new artist that's got some cool stuff. Like everybody became so anti-bro country, that they stopped wanting to listen to any modern country. Not all modern country is FGL. That being said, Chris Stapleton is still the best singer in the business, and we know that. And right before I left the band, we did a Grammy. There was a Grammy event honoring Lionel Richie, and a lot of people don't realize that Lionel Richie wrote "Lady," which was a Kenny Rogers hit, but it was written by Lionel. So at this event, Stapleton was singing "Lady," and he's a modern day Kenny, right? So it's a perfect fit. But the funny part is I had Little Big Town on one side of me, and they're spectacularly talented. And I had Dave Grohl on the other side, and Dave Grohl's a god. We all know that. And I'll never forget Dave Grohl. As Chris Stapleton was sound checking, Dave Grohl looks over at me and says, "Man, this guy is an effing rock star." Now, when Dave Grohl calls you an effing rock star, you're a rock star. So Chris Stapleton, I think, is the best. Like, you want to go listen to somebody that will make your soul move, it's Chris Stapleton.
Do you miss touring every single day?
No, never. Touring is a lot like the tour bus is a lot like the locker room. Mm-hmm. So when people leave, they miss the camaraderie. I got lucky, man. Like, I walked out of one industry and into another industry where I have camaraderie. Like, some of my best friends in the world work at ESPN. I've become so close to them because it's very much like a tour bus atmosphere. So to me, I still perform. It's just on radio every day, which radio is part of country music. I loved it. So, I still perform on radio all the time. I still get to hang out with the camaraderie and the competitive environment. And I still get to hang out in a place where I feel every day like my work matters. And that's, for me, I think it replaced so many of those holes. I will say this, though. I was never a born performer. Like, one of the things my wife always jokes about and laughs about is before every concert, I would text her and say, "Time to go make the donuts," which was from the old Dunkin' Donuts commercials when I was a kid. And after concerts, I would always text her money earned. And it's not because I was cold or callous or it was about the money. It was never about that. I had so many responsibilities during the show. I ran our tracks, like our computer systems, our counts. I played the fiddle, I played the dobro, the acoustic, a mandolin, a piano, a B3. Like, my job was to execute a show perfectly for the crowd. So I didn't look at it like, oh, I can come out here and really get in my own. No, my job was to go out there, feel like I'm in my own, but also execute perfectly. So for me, music was about execution. That's why I preferred my past as a studio musician to my past as a live performer in many ways, because studio music is about perfection and getting something you think can live forever.
Talking about perfection, how much are you a quote-unquote perfectionist at ESPN? Do you listen back a lot to yourself, your own work, listen to your work, reach out to other people at ESPN to have them listen to you? What do you kind of do to kind of take that perfectionist mindset that you had in the music industry to now, like, again, in the sports industry?
Yeah, I spot listen all the time. And that's sort of what we did on the road. Like, you record every show when you're touring, and you go back and you listen to the shows later and you make sure everybody's playing the right spots. But you're not going to have time all the time to listen to a 90-minute show every day, right? So you spot listen. So I do the same thing now. Like, a lot of times, especially when I've been on campus and I'll go, we have a gym on campus, I'll go early, I'll get on a treadmill, and while I'm on the treadmill, I'll just put up the podcast or whatever show I'm hosting and I'll listen. And I'm a heavy critique of myself, but I also have 2 or 3 guys that have really shaped and molded me that I send segments to all the time that I also know spot listen to me all the time to come in and remind me of the details. And the funny thing is that at my cubicle at ESPN, I'm not high enough up to get a door and a desk, but I got a cubicle, right? So my cubicle, I have little blue note cards everywhere. They're notes that I've been given from coaches. And I think taking coaching, no matter what you do, no matter what you are trying to do, like for me, I started as a podcast that nobody had ever heard of. And I grew that podcast from the ground up. But the real break for me came when a random person from ESPN that I'd done a favor for found me on Twitter, and I'd helped his cousin with some music stuff. And he said, "Hey, I see you have a podcast. I'll give it a listen if you want some notes." And I said, "Heck yeah." He sent me 3 pages worth of notes on everything to change. And a week later, I sent him a podcast link and I said, "Give this a listen." And he called me and said, "I've never had anybody take every note I gave them until you." I took 3 pages of notes and I integrated it because, again, the classical musician in me, you don't get to make a mistake twice, right? So you take your coaching. I think so many people in life in general ask for advice and then don't take it. Like, they ask for advice and they go back to doing what they really like to do because that's the easy thing. And for me, I look at it and say, even now, they do coaching sessions for us at ESPN, and I tell them all the time, I don't need to hear what's good. Don't waste my time with what's good. That's fine. Tell me what's bad so I can work on it and I can fix it. And and those are details. Just like a hitter always needs a hitting coach, I think radio hosts and TV hosts always need coaching because you forget some of the little details when you get into yourself.
Jason, this is my favorite part of the show. It's a fast 5 quick round. It's 5 quick questions, and you have however long you take to answer them. Are you ready?
I am ready for this.
Biggest pet peeve?
Michael Jordan versus LeBron, the debate. Hate it. Can never be solved, and we're wasting time. We should be celebrating LeBron right now for whatever he's worth and not having that stupid debate.
This is an interesting one. Go-to karaoke song.
Okay, Footloose. That's easy for me. Footloose is my favorite karaoke jam. Although Careless Whisper also very high on the list. Careless Whisper, great, but Footloose gets everybody dancing.
Best compliment you've ever received?
Wow, that is a that's a really good one. I would say, to me, I take so much respect out of what people, or so much self-worth out of what people think of my work. The fact that I've had some of the best at ESPN say that they haven't seen a work ethic like mine is a compliment that I will, it drives me to move forward. So that's the best compliment I could get.
Go to ice cream flavor.
Oh, okay. Does it have to be okay? So I'm a rainbow sherbet guy, but that's not really ice cream. So does that count, or does it not count? Because now I'm getting three flavors and it's not ice cream.
Right, that counts. I work at an ice cream place right now. I've worked at it since high school, and we sell it at an ice cream place. So it is considered ice cream, because if you go to an ice cream shop, you can get sherbet. Sherbet, it's made of milk. So, it's like it's in the family. It's in the family.
Okay. We'll take it. If I have to go to one ice cream, then other than that, it would be strawberry. I don't know why I'm so fruity with all of my flavors there, but yes.
And then the last one for the Fast Five, it's one I've never used before. If it fails, I'll do one more. What's one question you've always wanted to have been asked on a podcast?
Wow, one question I've always wanted to be asked. That's I feel like I've been asked so many. I don't know if I have one question I've always wanted to be asked, but there's one question I've only been asked once that I think is the best question I've ever been asked. And I will give kudos to Sarah Spain for asking me what my biggest failure was. Like, that was she asked what my biggest failure had been in life. And everybody always asks about your biggest successes. Nobody asks about your biggest failure. And that was a tough question for me to ask, because I don't spend a lot of time looking back.
Mm-hmm. Well, Jason, I guess my last question for you, it would be, what was your biggest failure? How did you get through that and help you throughout your career?
So I don't remember how I answered this with Sarah, but I've had several pretty major, letdowns. Like, I was in a band that nobody ever heard of, that kept getting record deals and losing record deals before we ever put out a song. We spent years touring, and we had some success, but never got anything to radio and never really made it. Like, I toured for 5 years with the band and made a total of $700 over 5 years. Right. So we obviously never made it. So that was probably my biggest failure, but from it, I still took so much. Like, I remember there was an opportunity in Nashville a few years ago at Sports Talk that I thought I was going to get, and I didn't get it. And at the time I thought, man, I don't know if this is going to work. But really, if I had to say, my biggest failure was my podcast, which sounds weird because my podcast got me to ESPN. But I built a podcast where I'll never forget. I had Fall Out Boy, Charlie Daniels, and Adam Schefter on the same podcast, all talking about different things. And it was this great episode. We launched it. I had like 40,000 listens. It was numbers I'd never seen, right? And so the week after that, I had no guests at all, because I was like, look, I got all this podcast momentum. I don't need a guest. I want people to get to know me. So the next week I posted the podcast, and I had a whopping 12 listens, 12 total for the week. And at the time, I was doing a podcast every week, no matter where we were in the world. So I remember sitting in a coffee shop in Norway, yelling into a microphone about the Green Bay Packers. And like, everybody else is out having fun, seeing castles and partying. And I'm sitting in a coffee shop trying to get internet in Europe to talk about the NFL. And they joked with me at the time. And I've seen many of these guys since then, like Rascal Flatts. I've got some really good friendships there with Joe Don and some of the guys. But I'll talk to some of the crew guys when I go to their shows, and they'll openly admit that they were making fun of me for wasting my time on a podcast that was not doing anything. Like, some weeks there were a few listens, some weeks there were a few thousand listens. I never could figure out the algorithm of how to make my podcast super successful. But the one thing that I took away from it is, it doesn't matter. Like, it doesn't matter how many listens I get. My look was, every week was going to be my demo, and it was going to be the best damn podcast I'd ever done in my life every single week, because you never know who's going to tune in and listen. And ultimately, when I did start to get my break, part of what really separated me was there were a few people that looked back and they said, man, we've gone back and listened to a bunch of your podcasts. How the hell did you do that while you were on the road and managed to keep the consistency and the quality right? So to me, my biggest failure was my podcast, but it also in many ways was my biggest success. So that's why I think we get too worked up about failure or success. And, you know, we sit there and we say these cliches with quarterbacks and cornerbacks about how you got to forget the last play and always live for the next play. But then in our own personal lives, we don't do that. We get so worried about what just happened and what's coming next. We don't live in the play that we have right now. And that's what I refuse to do. Like, if you get better every day at whatever you're doing, the rest of it doesn't matter.
Completely agree with you. Well said. Jason, thanks again for taking the time to come on the Whole Story podcast this morning. Where can everyone follow you on social media, listen to you on ESPN?
Yeah, so that's easy. Social media on Twitter and Instagram, it's at Jason Fitz. So it's super easy to find, and all my digital work goes out to Twitter there. You can find that there. And then obviously ESPN, you can check out ESPN Radio, ESPN News, Monday through Friday, 1 to 3 p.m. Eastern for First Take Your Take. I feel like I should do it, on Sirius XM Channel 80, also on the ESPN app. And if you didn't know this, you can just ask your smart speakers to play ESPN Radio, and it gets you straight to us.
Jason, thanks so much.
Thank you. I appreciate you having me.